That'll be 5.80. It's declined. Could you try again? Still declined, sir.
The morning Nam Woo-jin's life came apart, it didn't explode. It just quietly stopped working. His card was declined at a coffee shop he owned a stake in, and he stood there in front of the barista assuming it was a glitch. His assistant didn't answer her phone, which had never happened in 9 years. And when he reached the office, the security guard who'd greeted him by name every morning since the building opened asked him, without meeting his eyes, to please wait in the lobby while someone came down. That was how Woo-jin learned the board had suspended him not with a phone call, not with the courtesy of a warning, but with a junior legal associate descending in the elevator holding a printed letter she was clearly afraid to hand him. He read it twice in the lobby while people he'd hired walked past and pretended not to see him. The word at the center of it was misconduct. And the terrible thing, the thing that would keep him awake for months, was that it wasn't entirely a lie. For 2 years, his chief financial officer, a smooth and tireless man named Payo, had been moving company money into places it had no business going, vendor accounts that didn't quite exist, consulting fees for work no one could describe. And he had been clever about it. Never a single large theft, but hundreds of small ones. Each fraudulent transfer buried inside a stack of thousands of entirely legitimate approvals, so that any one page Woo-jin signed looked exactly like the honest page beside it. Woo-jin, busy and trusting, and a little in love with his own reputation for delegation, had signed what Payo put in front of him not because he was a fool, but because he had stopped reading closely, had let volume and trust do the work that attention should have. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that when it finally collapsed, his signature was on the documents that mattered, and Payo had lawyered up within the hour and started pointing one careful finger upward. The investigators didn't need to prove Woo-jin had planned the theft. They only needed to show he was the man in charge who'd let it happen on his watch, with his name, under his signature. In a courtroom, that distinction might save him. In the newspapers, it saved no one. His fiancée returned her ring through her younger sister, who wouldn't come inside, just handed him the small velvet box at the door with an apology that wasn't really for him. The friends who had lifted their glasses to him at his birthday 6 weeks earlier went quiet all at once, the way people do when standing near you suddenly costs something. Even his mother, who had believed every headline the moment it printed, because the world had told her so, and the world had always been right before, stopped leaving the house and grew short and strange on the phone, as though her son had become something she was ashamed to have made. In the space of a single week, Woo-jin went from a man whose calls were always returned to a man whose calls were the reason people changed their numbers. If you've ever been the last person to find out your own life was falling apart, if you've ever watched people you trusted decide who you were the very moment it got expensive to stand beside you, then stay with me, because I promise you, this man does not end up where he begins. Do me one quick favor before we go on. Tap that subscribe button. You are going to want to see how this one turns around. He didn't flee to some dramatic hideaway, because that wasn't the kind of man he was, or the kind of trouble he was in. He simply got in his car, which he still had for now, and drove until the city stopped following him in the rearview mirror. He drove 300 miles to the one property his company had all but forgotten it owned, a tired, salt-worn hotel on the coast called the Sea Haven. He knew it only as a line on a spreadsheet, an underperforming asset he had personally approved budget cuts for years earlier without ever once setting foot inside it. He booked 2 nights online under his own name, because using a false one never even occurred to him he wasn't a fugitive, just a man who needed a door that locked and a window with something other than his own reflection in it. He wore a plain jacket, kept his head low, and told himself that 300 miles from the financial pages, no one would recognize a hotel executive whose face had run in business columns and quarterly reports Never on television, and never on a magazine cover the kind of famous that lives in the papers people skim past. Not the kind that stops a stranger on the street. He was mostly right. The tired young man at the front desk didn't know him from anyone. But the woman who ran the place knew something was wrong with him inside of an hour, and she was not a woman who let wrong things sit unexamined in her lobby. You've booked 2 nights, and you've asked the front desk twice whether we have a rear exit. She was standing near the elevator when he came down looking for a vending machine, a tablet tucked under one arm, her name tag reading Keisha Williams, general manager. She wasn't hostile. She was simply direct, in the way of someone who has seen every kind of guest a struggling hotel attracts and has stopped being surprised by any of them. You flinch when a phone comes out, and you tipped my bellhop like you were apologizing to him for something he didn't know about. She held out a hand, brisk and businesslike. Keisha Williams, I run the Sea Haven. You don't owe me your story. But if the trouble you drove in with is the kind that follows a man to my front desk, I'd rather hear it from you than from a stranger asking for you by name. Woo-jin, who had spent 20 years being handled and flattered and told comfortable versions of the truth, found himself completely disarmed by a person who simply described him back to himself and waited. It's not that kind of trouble, he said. It's the boring kind. Money. My name in the wrong headline. Something at the corner of her mouth almost moved. The kind that feels like the end of the world and turns out not to be. We get a great deal of that here. The ocean's good for it. It's very large, and it does not care about your problems, which people find clarifying. And then she went back to her tablet and left him standing there. And he thought, with something like relief, that would surely be the end of it. It was not the end of it, because the Sea Haven was quietly falling apart, and Woo-jin discovered he was constitutionally incapable of not noticing how. The next morning, over weak coffee in a dining room with water stains on the ceiling, he watched Keisha Williams work the front desk, defuse a plumbing emergency, and talk down a furious tour operator whose block booking had been double sold all inside of 40 minutes, with a staff of 6 people doing the visible work of 12. He watched her disappear and come back in a housekeeping smock to cover a room attendant shift herself because the woman's son had spiked a fever at school. He pulled the property up on his phone, which still worked because that particular account hadn't been frozen yet, and looked at what he had always seen only as a number. Occupancy sitting at 30%. A maintenance backlog stacked up like unpaid debts. A general manager holding a sinking building above the waterline with nothing but her own 2 hands and a refusal to let go. He had signed the memo that starved this place. In a boardroom that had been a rounding error. In its threadbare dining room, watching the woman it was drowning. It felt like something he owed. So when his 2 nights ended, and he found he had nowhere in the world he actually wanted to go, Woo-jin did something the man he'd been a month earlier would never have been able to understand. He found Keisha in the back office and asked whether the hotel was hiring. If you've ever had to swallow every ounce of your pride and start over from the absolute bottom, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. It tells me you want to see where these 2 are going. Now let's keep going. She looked at him as though he'd suggested something faintly insane. You want a job? Here. You're short-staffed. I've been watching. You're doing 3 people's work and losing. Everyone here is doing 3 people's work. What I can't work out is why a man who tips like a bank would ask me for minimum wage and a mop. She set the tablet down, and her eyes on him changed sharper now, assessing. You should know I looked you up the first night. I run a business. A man checks in nervous and cash-heavy under a real name. I do my homework. Nam Woo-jin, the hotel executive. The fraud story. She said it plainly, without any drama at all, which was somehow worse than an accusation. I read the whole thing. Half of it is probably noise. The internet always makes a mess sound louder than a courtroom will. But it is your name, and your name is radioactive right now. And if I put Nam Woo-jin on my payroll and it reaches corporate, they will use it as the last excuse they've been looking for to shut me down and sell this place for the land. She let that sit. So no, I can't hire you. It would be a loaded gun pointed at the only thing I've got. He nodded and started to stand, and she stopped him. But Keisha exhaled, like she was already annoyed at herself. I've got no rule against a guest who wants to make himself useful in exchange for a reduced rate. Paid off the books, arranged quietly. You'd be a man with a cheap room who happens to help out. Not an employee. Nothing with your name on a document. She slid an apron across the desk toward him. That's the most I can offer. And honestly, it's already more than smart. She said it half to herself and added, nobody up the chain even looks at this place anymore. No visits, no calls. A name on a quarterly report they've already decided to sell. That's the only reason I can do this at all. As far as head office knows, the Sea Haven runs itself. Let's keep it that way. She had known who he was the entire time. That was the thing that undid him, not that he had fooled her, because he hadn't for a single hour, but that she had seen exactly what he was, read the worst version of it in black and white, and chosen to hand him an apron anyway. Why? He asked, and he meant it. Why help me at all? You just said I'm a risk to the one thing you care about. Keisha considered him for a long moment. Because you looked, that first night, like a man who has never once in his life been told no and had to survive it. And I figured the ocean and a sink full of dishes might teach you faster than any lawyer could. She picked her tablet back up. And because my mother cleaned rooms in a place just like this one for 20 years, and in all that time not one man with a nice watch ever looked at her twice. So maybe it's good for one of you to find out, just once, what the floor feels like from down there. She turned back to her screen. 6 a.m. Don't be late. And Mr. Nam, for the record, I still think you probably deserve some of what's coming to you. Being careless with other people's money isn't nothing. But I don't believe you're the monster they printed, and I have got a great many dishes. He was bad at every task that required practiced hands, but not in a way that was funny for long, just a man in his 40s using his hands for the first time in decades, slow and clumsy and quietly humiliated by it. He broke a water glass his first morning and paid for it out of his own thinning wallet without being asked, which Keisha noticed and filed away without comment. His lowest afternoon came in the second week, when a small tour group recognized nothing about him but treated the man clearing their plates like furniture, and he stood in the service hallway afterward with his jaw tight, feeling every inch of the distance between the boardroom and the bus tray. It was there that the old man from room 12 found him a long-term guest, widowed, quiet, who paid by the month and kept mostly to himself. He didn't say anything wise. He just pressed a piece of wrapped hard candy into Woo-jin's hand, the kind grandparents keep in coat pockets, patted his shoulder once, and shuffled on toward the porch to watch the water. Woo-jin stood holding it for a long moment, absurdly close to tears over a 10-cent sweet from a stranger who'd decided, for no reason at all, that he looked like a man who needed one small kindness. He kept the wrapper in his pocket for a week. He learned that he was far better with the guests than with the tasks. He talked the same furious tour operator into a second block booking, without ever once mentioning that he had negotiated deals 10,000 times that size, in rooms the man would never be allowed to enter. He learned the old man from room 12 took his coffee at dawn and liked company that didn't need conversation, and started taking his own first break out on that porch beside him. Over the first 2 weeks, he stopped being a guest and became, without anyone announcing it, a working part of the strange, stubborn little machine of the place. And Keisha, who trusted no one quickly and most people never, found herself trusting him in small, reluctant increments because he showed up before 6 every morning, never once complained, and never, not a single time, used the phrase times when I ran things, even on the days she could see it costing him not to. What grew between them grew the way real things do, slowly, unglamorously, out of proximity and small proofs, rather than one cinematic spark. There was the evening the ancient neon sign out front finally sputtered and died for good, and Keisha stood in the parking lot, looking up at it with an expression Woo-jin had not seen her wear before. Not frustration, but something closer to grief, like the dark sign was one more thing being taken from her that she couldn't afford to replace. He didn't say anything that night. But 2 mornings later, the sign was lit again, humming and whole, and when she demanded to know who had authorized the repair and where the money had come from, he only shrugged and said, "Nobody authorized it. I just didn't like watching a good place look ashamed of itself." She stared at him for a long, long moment. "You spent your own money. I've got one personal account. The regulators didn't freeze. Small, old, in my own name, nothing to do with the company. It won't last forever." It seemed like a good use of some of it. And Keisha said, quietly, "You keep doing things like that, Woo-jin, and I am going to have to start liking you." And that would be extremely inconvenient for the both of us. It was the first time she'd said his real name, and she'd said it soft. There was the slow night in the empty bar when she finally told him about her mother, the 20 years of other people's rooms, the swollen ankles, the pride she took in a job the world had decided was invisible, and how Keisha had put herself through a hospitality degree working 2 jobs and had come back to a place like the one that had worn her mother down, not despite all of it, but because of it. Everybody kept asking why I'd take a job managing a dying hotel for half what I could make in the city, she said. But I looked at this place, and I didn't see a bad asset. I saw somewhere a woman like my mother could work with her head up. I thought if I could just keep it alive, keep it times decent. She stopped and laughed at herself. "It's not smart. My mentor told me the same thing you're thinking, that I'm pouring myself into something the numbers say should already be gone." She looked at him, half challenging. "Go on. You built 40 hotels. Tell me it's a bad asset." And Woo-jin, who a month ago would have agreed without a second thought, heard himself say, "I think it's the first thing I've seen in years that somebody was keeping alive for the right reasons. The numbers were never the whole truth. I just built a career pretending they were." She was quiet a moment, then admitted the thing she'd told no one. For 3 years, she'd spent her rare days off in the county archives and the land records office, reading deeds and surveys and century-old permits, hunting for anything, any clause, any old designation, any forgotten protection that might give her a legal reason to stop head office from ever selling the ground out from under the place. "I haven't found it yet," she said. "But it's there. Old buildings leave a paper trail. You just have to want it badly enough to read every page." And there was the night, weeks in, when they sat on the back porch with the tide going all the way out, close enough that it would have been the easiest thing in the world to close the last few inches, and neither of them did because he still hadn't told her the one true thing that mattered, that he technically helped own the very hotel she was pouring her life into, and every day the not saying sat heavier on his chest. She told him he had never named a single friend who'd stayed when the money left. "That's not the money's fault," she said. "That's the man's. You can fix a man. You can't fix money. Money never had a problem in the first place." He didn't answer. He just understood that she was the first person in years to tell him something he needed to hear instead of something he wanted to, and that he was in a great deal more trouble than any headline had ever put him in. He should have told her then. He almost did. The words came all the way up his throat one night on the porch. "There's something you need to know about this hotel, about me. and he watched her face turn toward the water, unguarded for once, and he could not make himself be the thing that closed it. He told himself he'd tell her when the sale threat passed, when the timing was kinder, when he'd earned enough goodwill to survive it. There was never going to be a kind time, and some part of him knew that and stayed quiet anyway. That failure, small, cowardly, human, chosen a little more each day, he said nothing was the one that would cost him, because the truth about a place like the Sea Haven never stays buried. It lives in the paperwork, and Keisha Williams read the paperwork. The reckoning came the way real ones do, not with a villain's grand entrance, but with a document. Corporate had been circling the hotel for weeks. Woo-jin knew it, and had said nothing. Another silence stacked on the pile, and one gray afternoon the closure packet finally arrived. A thick sale and transfer file the head office sent Keisha to sign, the machinery of shutting her hotel down and handing the land to a buyer. Anyone else would have signed the summary page and gone home sick. Keisha read all of it, the way she read everything, down into the ownership schedules and the holding company structure most managers never even see. And there, 3 layers deep in a chain of entities nobody was meant to trace, listed against a minority stake in the very asset she was being ordered to surrender, was a name she had been saying softly on her own back porch for weeks, Nam Woo-jin. She read it 4 times. Then she found him in the kitchen, drying glasses, and set the open file on the counter between them with terrible gentleness. The page turned to the line. "Explain this to me," she said, "and choose your words like they matter. Because right now it looks like you help own the hotel I have been killing myself to save. The one I told you about my mother's in." Woo-jin looked down at his own name and felt the floor tilt. "It's a family investment trust," he said. "It holds minority interests in dozens of properties, small stakes, spread across hotels, buildings, land I've never set foot in. It's managed automatically. I haven't reviewed the portfolio line by line in years. I signed off on the whole thing once a quarter without ever seeing the individual names in it. So you didn't know. I didn't know until I got here and saw the property," he admitted. "And something about it nagged at me enough that I finally went looking. And there it was. A stake I'd technically held the entire time in the exact kind of place I'd signed the memos to starve." She didn't shout. He almost wished she would have. Her face just closed over like a shutter coming down. The exact blankness he'd seen on 100 boardroom faces the day they'd decided he was finished. "Did you tell me?" she asked. "Or was I always going to find out on my own, in a file, doing my job?" And there was no answer that survived the question, because she found out everything the same way, by reading what other people skimmed, and he had eaten at her staff table for weeks and taken her trust in small, careful pieces and never once said the plain thing himself. "You let me feel sorry for you," she said quietly. "You let me tell you why I stayed, while you stood there knowing you were on the deed." She closed the file. "Go back to your city, Mr. Nam. I have kept this place alive without a single one of you for years. I don't need one of you to start now." He didn't argue, because she was right, and arguing would have been one more thing done for himself. He left the Sea Haven because she'd asked him to, and he owed her at least that much, and drove the 300 miles back to the city he'd run from. But somewhere on that road, it stopped being a retreat and became the first honest decision he'd made in 2 years. He was going back to do the single hardest, least cinematic thing available to him: stop hiding and start fighting the right way. He hired the one lawyer who would still take his calls, a blunt, unsentimental woman named Miss Ree, who told him in their first meeting that she could not make him look innocent because he wasn't, but she could help the truth get its shoes on. And so began the unglamorous work that no montage does justice to: the depositions, the forensic accountants, the days spent explaining over and over to skeptical people that he had not stolen. He had failed to look. He turned over every record he had, including the ones that made him look negligent and lazy and proud. Because Miss Ree said the fastest way through was to stop protecting the version of himself that no longer existed. And it was in that turning over head down for weeks, in the very documents he'd once signed without reading, that Woo-jin did the single most useful thing anyone did for his own case. The forensic accountants could trace where money went, but they didn't know the company the way its builder did. He was the one who stopped on a vendor name on a payment schedule and knew, with a cold certainty, that it was wrong a facilities management firm billing the flagship property for work he remembered commissioning from someone else entirely, years ago, a contract he'd personally signed. It was a company that shouldn't exist, invoicing for work that had already been done by another. He flagged it to Miss Ree, and Miss Ree flagged it to the investigators, and it was the loose thread that, once pulled, unraveled the rest because it was the one Pio had been proudest of. The fake vendor so cleanly built that only the man who'd hired the real one could ever have known the difference. Woo-jin's own negligence had let the fraud happen. His own memory was what finally caught it, and all the while, Pio was winning the story. He had the better instinct for it, where Woo-jin had gone silent and coastal. Pio went loud and everywhere, granting careful interviews from a lawyer's office, appearing on the evening business programs in a good suit to insist, sorrowfully, that he had only ever followed the directives of a boss who signed everything and read nothing. Every few weeks, another article ran quoting unnamed sources close to Mr. Pio, each one painting Woo-jin a little more clearly as the architect and Pio as the loyal subordinate left holding the bag. It was maddening, and it was effective. And there were nights Woo-jin wanted to fire back through the press, and Miss Ree talked him out of every one. "He's building a house on the story," she said. "Let him. Houses built on lies have a specific problem. The ground under them is real, and the truth is very patient. Slowly, quietly, the forensic accountants kept pulling threads, and the investigators' attention began to shift from the man whose name was on the signatures to the man who had actually moved the money. It did not resolve in a week, because nothing real does. It took months. But the shape of the case changed, and that was everything. And in those same months, 300 miles away, the ticking clock ran down towards zero. The buyer wanted the beachfront land, not the hotel on it, and the company set a closure date and began the paperwork to sell. But Keisha Williams did not lose things she could outwork, and she went looking for the one thing a spreadsheet can't argue with a technicality. She found it the way she found everything, buried in records nobody else read. The Sea Haven's original structure, the oldest surviving building on that stretch of coast, quietly eligible for historic preservation protection that would strangle any plan to demolish it for land. It was a real angle, a good one. The kind a corporate lawyer would never have bothered to dig for on a bad asset. She filed for the designation herself, drafted the bookings campaign that would prove the place was viable, and lined up a community lease proposal that would let the hotel keep operating under protection. She had the plan. What she did not have was time. The preservation review took months, and the closure date was weeks away. The buyer only had to move fast, and corporate only had to sign. Before her filing ever got heard, the delay arrived from nowhere. First, a zoning question surfaced against the buyer's demolition plan. Then a quiet procedural snag froze the transfer just long enough to blow past the closure date and drop the sale, by law, into the window where her preservation review could actually be heard. Corporate was furious and baffled. The buyer, spooked by friction it couldn't source, walked. Keisha should have been relieved. Instead, she sat at the front desk at midnight, staring at the filing that had bought her the runway, because she recognized the shapes of it, the specific, surgical way someone had found exactly the pressure point that would buy time without ever touching her plan or taking her win. It was the move of a man who had built 40 hotels, and knew precisely where the seams were. It had no name on it anywhere. It didn't need one. She already knew whose hands left a mark like that, and she sat with the strange ache of being helped, at a distance, by the one person she'd told to leave a man who'd bought her time and made sure she'd never be able to prove he had, so that the save would still, always, be hers. He'd done it the way you do things for someone when you've finally stopped needing the credit. He heard about the sales secondhand, from Miss Ree, and did not call to announce a rescue because arriving with a checkbook to fix her problem was the exact old instinct he was burying. He spent the last of his leverage and his money and his favors buying her runway, and not 1 inch of the plane. She flew it herself. The legal reckoning came on an ordinary Tuesday, months after he'd left the coast. Woo-jin was in the room for the deposition when it turned Pio across the table, relaxed, half smiling, coasting on the same easy confidence that had gotten him this far. Right up until the forensic accountant slid one particular statement across the table and named the account he'd been proudest of hiding. Woo-jin watched the exact second it happened, the smile holding a beat too long, then the color leaving his face as the floor he'd been standing on all this time quietly opened beneath him. There was no shouting, no confession, no grand undoing, just a careful man realizing, in real time, that the thing he'd been sure no one would ever find had been found. Within the week he was arrested, and in his records was every forged authorization and every routed transfer. The whole architecture of a theft Woo-jin had been too proud and too busy to see. The charges against Woo-jin were reduced to what he had actually done a serious regulatory failure, not a crime of intent. He was fined heavily. He was barred from holding certain corporate roles for a period of years. He was, publicly and permanently, the executive who hadn't been paying attention while his company was robbed. But he was not a fraud, and the headline that had taken an afternoon to destroy him took its slow, grudging time admitting it, in corrections buried where the accusation had once been a banner. When it was over, Nam Woo-jin was not a billionaire anymore. The legal fees, the settlements, the stake he'd been forced to surrender it took very nearly all of it. He came out the far side with a small fraction of what he'd once had and a name that would carry a quiet asterisk for the rest of his life. Most of what he'd lost, he found he didn't much miss. The ordeal had burned away the exact part of him that would have, but not all of it came back, and he made himself stop pretending it would. His mother, who had shut herself in the house through the worst of the headlines, did not simply open the door again when the corrections ran. She had believed the story that was the wound that didn't close, and being proven wrong is a different thing from being made whole. She took his calls now, sometimes. She was polite, but the easy, unguarded warmth of before had gone somewhere the truth couldn't reach it, and Woo-jin learned to sit with the fact that clearing your name does not unring the bell in the people who heard it first. Some doors, once shut, only ever open partway again. He wrote to her anyway, every month, and did not require an answer to keep writing. It was the one loss he carried out of that year that no verdict was ever going to give back, and carrying it honestly, without pretending it didn't ache, was its own kind of growing up. He went back to the Sea Haven because he wanted to, and because he owed her an apology he'd had months to get right, and because it was the only place his mind had gone quiet in years. He did not go back to buy it. He couldn't have anymore, and even if he could, he understood at last that purchasing his way back into her regard was the one thing that would prove he'd learned nothing. He drove the 300 miles with a duffel bag on the passenger seat and no watch on his wrist, and he walked up to the front desk of the hotel he had once helped starve and now could not afford, and he asked the tired young man there whether the general manager had a minute. Keisha came out from the back office and stopped when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The sign he'd fixed hummed faintly through the front windows. "You're not a billionaire anymore," she said finally. "No." I read it. The real story once it came out. Her arms were crossed, but her voice had lost the shudder it had closed on him the last time. You could have called when you heard about the sale. You could have swept in with a checkbook and played the hero. I thought about it for about 10 seconds, he admitted, and then I remembered you'd rather lose this place honestly than be handed it by a man trying to buy his way out of an apology. So I did the only useful thing I had left, and I made sure you never saw my hand in it. I found the procedural snag that stalled the transfer, bought the review a few extra weeks to actually be heard. That's all it was. Time. The case that saved this place was yours, start to finish. I just kept the door open long enough for you to walk through it. Her eyes moved over his face, and something in them, the last guarded thing, finally let go. The delay on the transfer. That was you. It wasn't a question. I didn't want my name anywhere near it. My name's radioactive, and it certainly wasn't going to help your filing. It was you. She shook her head slowly. You bought me time, and made sure I'd never be able to thank you for it. You didn't need me to save it. You needed a few more weeks, and those I could get you without anyone knowing where they came from. You should have told me who you were back then, she said. On the first day. Or the 5th. Any day but never. Yes, Woo-jin said. That's the one thing I got wrong that I can still actually fix. So I'm telling you now, plainly, before anything else happens between us, I'm Nam Woo-jin. I made a serious, careless mistake that hurt a great many people, and I've paid for it, and I'll keep paying for it. I'm not rich, I'm barely employable. And somewhere in the worst year of my life, I fell in love with the woman who handed me an apron instead of a verdict, and I have spent every day since trying to become someone who deserved to say so out loud. That's all of it. Nothing left out this time. Keisha was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the ghost of the old dryness, that was a considerably better speech than the one you didn't give me the first time. I've been getting a great deal of practice at honesty, he said. It's growing on me. They did not rush it after that, and that was the entire point. He didn't move back in, and he didn't presume. He took a room in town he could actually afford, and he showed up, day after day, and slowly they built the thing back on a foundation that could hold weight. When his legal situation finally allowed it, he took a real job, an honest, on-the-books, modestly paid job helping Keisha do the one thing she had never had a partner for, fight corporate to keep the Sea Haven open for good. It did not go smoothly, because things worth keeping rarely do, and the hardest blow was the one they'd both seen coming since the first day. Corporate found out he was there. It surfaced the way these things do, in a reporter's follow-up call to head office asking why a disgraced former executive was living at and working out of one of their properties, and the story that ran was ugly. Disgraced exec hiding at hotel, he helped run into the ground. It was the exact loaded gun Keisha had named in the very first conversation, his radioactive name. Pointed straight at the one thing she loved, and now it went off. Head office, humiliated and looking for someone to blame, moved to fast-track the sale and formally opposed her preservation filing, arguing the whole effort was tainted by its association with him. For a few terrible days, it looked as though loving him had cost her the Sea Haven after all. And here was the difference between the man he'd been and the man he'd become. He did not try to fix it with money or leverage or a quiet call to someone who owed him. He offered to disappear, to take his name completely off the property and out of her fight, if that was what saved it. Keisha looked at him for a long moment and said, "No, I'm done letting your name be the thing that decides what happens to this place. It's a building. It stands or falls on what it is, not on who you are." So she fought it head on, in the open walked the county board through the fraud story and the corrections, made them see that punishing a landmark for one man's headline was its own kind of cowardice. The preservation review still had to survive a thorough inspector who found the old wiring and a failing roof section that had to be fixed before any protection would hold. The first grant application still came back denied on a technicality. 2 of her 6 staff still left for steadier work in the thick of it. But she met each one the way she met everything. And Woo-jin, no longer solving things with a checkbook, rewrote the viability case with everything he knew about running numbers for a place instead of against it, and won the grant appeal with a filing so meticulous the county had no room left to say no. It took the better part of a year. And a man who had built 40 hotels and lost everything turned out to be very, very good at that fight when he no longer had a single thing to prove, and when, for the first time, the name on the paperwork wasn't the point. Together they did what she could never quite do alone, turned the closure into a reprieve, the reprieve into a protected lease, the dying asset into a place with its head up. It never became a jewel. It became something better and more honest. A decent hotel, climbing slowly, run by 2 people who had chosen it and each other on purpose. And somewhere in that year, the working partnership quietly became something else. And this time, they let it happen in the open, in daylight, on purpose. He courted her the slow way, the honest way, dinners on his modest wage at the one good place in town, walks along the water when the season was too cold for guests, a standing habit of bringing her coffee at the front desk because he'd never forgotten she took it standing up. There were no more secrets to detonate, and the absence of them was its own kind of romance. She watched him for months for the seam that would open, the thing he wasn't saying, and slowly came to understand there wasn't one anymore. He met her mother properly and washed dishes in her mother's kitchen without being asked, and her mother, who had spent a lifetime being invisible to men with nice watches, watched this one dry her plates and said nothing, but softened. By the time the year turned, they weren't a manager and a volunteer, or a billionaire and the woman who'd humbled him. They were just 2 people who had chosen each other on the far side of everything, and had done the unhurried work of making sure the choice would hold. He proposed on the back porch at low tide, and there was nothing extravagant about it, because extravagance had belonged to the man he used to be, and she had never once met him. He'd saved 6 months of an honest paycheck for the ring, and he said, "I can't offer you an empire. I had one, and it turned out to be made of paper, and it blew away the first hard wind. But I can offer you a man who reads what he signs now. A man who knows the price of a thing and the worth of it are 2 different numbers, and who would rather sweep your floors for the rest of his life than run anyone else's tower. Marry me, Keisha." And Keisha Williams, who had never once in her life been handed a single thing she hadn't earned with her own 2 hands, took a long breath and said, "I spent a lot of years not trusting men who showed up with nice things. Turns out, the one I'd trust showed up with a duffel bag and a court fine and fixed my sign without telling me." She kissed him. "Yes, but understand me, you are still on dish duty. I would be disappointed by anything less." They married on the beach behind the Sea Haven the next spring. Small, no press. None of the people who'd raised glasses to him in his old life, and vanished. The staff who had become his family stood in the sand. Keisha's mother sat in the front row and wept without any shame at all. The old man from room 12, who tipped and wrapped candy, stood in the place a family would have stood for a man who had lost his to a headline. Woo-jin wore a plain suit. Keisha wore no shoes. And when he said, "I do," it was in the voice of a man who had finally, at real cost, learned the difference between being important and being known, and had chosen, without hesitation, the second one. Some seasons at the Sea Haven were still hard, because that is what honest things are. He learned to live smaller, and discovered, to his genuine surprise, that smaller fit him better than everything he'd lost ever had. On the slow nights, he and Keisha sat on the porch and watched the tide do the one reliable thing in either of their histories. And once, when she asked whether he ever missed it, the empire, the name, The weight of being someone whose calls got returned, he thought about it honestly. The way she had taught him to think about everything. "I miss being certain," he said at last. "I don't miss being that man. He had everything, and he never once got to feel this." Keisha put her head on his shoulder. Inside, a busboy dropped a tray of glasses with an almighty crash, and the two of them winced in unison and then laughed without turning around because by now they both knew, all the way down, that some things are worth more than a fortune. Like a floor you are proud to sweep. Like a good place kept alive for the right reasons. Like a person who looked at you on the worst day of your life, read the very worst version of you in black and white, and decided before you had done one single thing to earn it that you might still be worth the trouble. If this story got to you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe, tap that like, and tell me in the comments, would you have given Woo-jin a second chance the way Keisha did, or made him earn it even longer? Drop your answer below, and I'll see you in the next one.